Where there is light, there is always darkness. For every action, there is a reaction. And where there is good, evil is not lurking far behind. Nowhere is this axiom more apparent than during the winter months, where the children of the world are stalked by the most heinous of creatures. A curious beast, the coming of Krampus precedes the winter solstice every year on the 5th of December. On this day, the demoniac creature holds in judgment the yearly conduct of our children, and renders a curious punishment should they be found wanting. The antithesis of St. Nicholas, Krampus is indeed terrifying to behold. With the body of a man fused to that of a goat, its lengthy horns and serpentine tongue add all the more shock to its disturbing visage. Intelligent and malicious, Krampus accompanies the winter saint on his rounds through the cities and towns throughout the world, bestowing various queer punishments upon those children who have been misbehaved. These punishments range from the delivery of coal, hidings, and even extends to kidnappings on rare occasions. Krampus is a weird creature in that his motivations are entirely unknown, and yet he continues to inflict his judgment. Physical force and fleeing are ineffective methods to avoid his wrath. With supernatural strength and speed, and an uncanny knowledge of his victims' locations, Krampus is always able to render his retribution upon those children who have been less than savory. Interestingly enough, Krampus ignores all adults and minors above the age of innocence. No matter how foul these individuals may act, they never draw the attention of this terrifying judge, which further clouds his intentions, as we cannot discern why he chooses this age as the point at which he terminates his consideration. With so many mysteries surrounding this creature, it's hardly any wonder that his origin is ultimately unknown. Although St. Nicholas was indeed human at one point, Krampus seems to be a far older creature, and has formed a symbiotic relationship with the saint. Although the pair do not work in tandem per se, they are often seen together tending the same household at once. Whether intentional or simply a coincidence remains to be seen. Despite what one might imagine, parents of young children often find the threat of Krampus to be a useful way to keep their children in line. Although he is a nightmare to any parent having to endure a visit by him, invoking his name is often enough to set even the most rambunctious of children at rest, which has its uses, as one can imagine. However, what is quite disturbing is the moral implications of this creature's existence. An unknown and omniscient arbiter of good and evil, Krampus has kept many a philosopher awake at night as they struggle to justify their visions for society. Since time immemorial, this creature has stalked our lands, and there is no sign that he may give hence to his actions. Though a boon for troubled parents, his existence is nevertheless quite troubling for anyone concerned with safely raising a child. We can only hope that he does not extend his scope beyond what we have endured thus far. Krampus occupies a strange position in popular culture. Like the Centaur in Phoenix, he is often not directly referred to, but instead he is the embodiment of an idea. Nevertheless, we can still find books, art, and occasionally audio-visual media depicting Krampus directly. This is not surprising considering his frightening visage. Krampus is quite devilish in his appearance. A forked tongue and large horns with cloven hooves to boot, Krampus is certainly quite pagan in his appearance. His goal is to punish bad children on the day before the feast of St. Nicholas, which takes place traditionally on December 6th. So, on the 5th of December, he can be seen wandering the streets armed with a switch in order to beat naughty children. What's more is that he also issues lumps of coal instead of presents, as if the beating weren't sufficient enough of a punishment. As such, his essential features are what we come to consider to be his influence on culture. To wit, any punishment before or on Christmas is itself rendered from the concept of Krampus. This has even seen something of a merger between himself and Santa, where the latter will instead issue coal to those children who are naughty. When combined with the promise of presents, it is clear to see how the carrot-stick duality of Santa and Krampus would be useful to any parent having trouble keeping their child in line while raising them. From the Grinch to Scrooge of Christmas Carol fame, and even more light-hearted renditions, it is quite easy to find the Krampus all over the culture of Christmas. The Grinch is perhaps the most similar to Krampus, as he is directly responsible for the removal of enjoyment from Christmas, while the tale of Scrooge, through his greed, is similarly responsible for harming the Christmas experience of others. Though reminiscent of Krampus, these illusions do betray one particular aspect of this creature, which is that he is depicted as possessing no particular malice towards his victims. Rather, he is driven by his weird sense of justice. As such, we can see that the previous examples, the character of Grinch is not in fact the Krampus, but rather, he has the spirit of Krampus act upon him, in much the same way as the angels act upon Scrooge. And so these tales are very much about Krampus, but in a very unexpected manner. With this aspect of Krampus apprehended, we can extend the depictions of his spirit to many more works of fiction. Most humorously, John MacLeod from Die Hard would easily be described as a Krampus in this conception. It's strange to think of the frightening monster in such a way, but when considering his purpose and demeanor, it is clear that Krampus is an important part of forming the duality of Christmas, a time when our sense of just rewards is rendered most palpable. And so, with this image in mind, we may well find Krampus in many Christmas media without realizing it, a very interesting inversion of what one might expect upon seeing him. The origin of Krampus is not as complicated as one might come to expect. However, he does have a very long history. From his appearance, it is obvious that his ultimate origins lie in some European pagan religion. Moreover, his name would suggest a Germanic origin. Although his purpose in these religions isn't clear, his future would eventually become bonded with Christian beliefs. His devilish appearance naturally led him to being conflated with Satan in the Middle Ages. Supposedly, this led to the chains appearing on his person as some kind of symbol of his defeat. However, he eventually came to be paired with the character of Father Christmas, and so his modern purpose and character became defined. Curiously, while it has become tradition to leave out cookies and milk for Santa, Krampus has often been left a tote of schnapps for his consumption. These tributes, though innocuous at first, were perhaps born from pagan sacrifices of some kind, although there is no direct evidence as to their purpose. Threats of, be good or the Satan analog will get you, naturally became a part of these cultures, and, of course, Krampus was considered inherently evil as a consequence. Indeed, as recently as the last century, the Austrian government attempted to quell a resurgence in Krampus-related celebrations on the basis that he is in fact evil. These celebrations may also give us a hint as to how Krampus may have been used in the past. Although somewhat unfounded, it is not difficult to imagine how a few men might dress as Krampus every year and pretend to stalk the streets of a small town or village in hopes of keeping children in line, much in the same way as people dress as Santa during Christmas, further adding to his mystique. Although Krampus has become less popular in recent years, his history and influence in our cultures still continue to this day. Despite, and perhaps because of his simple history, we can certainly expect to see him for ages still to come. It is obvious that the Krampus is quite impossible. Having many similar characteristics to Santa, such as traveling the world in one night and being impossibly strong and omniscient. Indeed, many of the criticisms laid at the feet of Saint Nicholas can be directed with equal gravity towards Krampus. However, an interesting consideration is to look at Krampus in his role as a judge. How might Krampus determine which child has been naughty and which child has been good, in a way that we might all agree with his judgment? We would, for example, consider that one child who bullies another to be a rather mean and nasty individual, deserving of any punishment that they might receive. However, if that same bullying is born as a maladapted response strategy to a difficult situation at home, could we then truly hold the child responsible? Then, in this circumstance, would Krampus be able to justify punishing the child when it is not entirely the child's fault for their bad behavior? We could take this moral consideration even further when we include the idea that a child's mind is not entirely developed, and as such they may not fully comprehend the consequences of their actions. Harm that is not immediately visible is to a child an entirely abstract concept. Indeed, few adults can truly understand abstract morality. For example, many of us still even to this day struggle to avoid littering. How then can we expect a child to meet this standard if many of the grown-ups of the world cannot manage the same themselves? We might argue that the child can be held responsible in how well they follow the instructions of their parents or elders, and their success in this matter would then decide whether they have been naughty or not. According to the legend of Krampus, this would certainly seem to be the case, and more generally speaking, considering the essentially Christian culture in which Krampus exists, does this then mean that Christian doctrine ultimately guides the actions of Krampus? In all of these authorities, we can almost immediately find flaws. Again, if the parents or elders themselves are less than sterling in character, can we hold the child responsible for following their instructions, even if those instructions include ostensibly bad conduct? Moreover, regarding the church, could the child then not ask the Christian God for forgiveness a day prior to Krampus's arrival, and be spared his punishment? Clearly, from all of these questions, we can see that the matter is far more complicated than a simple decision as to whether the child has been naughty or nice. Rather, it involves a complicated interlocking series of considerations that will inevitably negate one another. Neither parent, church, nor guardian seem to be a satisfactory guide as to how Krampus should pass his judgment, and although conduct is ultimately the decision of the child, their cognitive immaturity shows that they are perhaps less responsible than what we would consider as being worth of a supernatural hiding. Broadly speaking, this moral epistemology is not as simple as one might imagine. We could argue that morals are a consequence of our biology, as all societies share many similar moral beliefs. However, that same reasoning might also define morals using game theory, where they exist as the rule set ensuring the perpetuation of games. In the prior case, all children would have an innate sense of right and wrong, while in the latter case, the child would need time to learn the heuristics for social expectations in morality. Needless to say, would that supernatural moral arbiters such as Krampus exist, it would certainly change the landscape of moral philosophy. Already in our questions we have touched on concepts of hedonism, free will, social responsibility, to a small extent utilitarianism, and, at last, some ideas that are baked into our legal systems, such as the concept of maturity, not to mention religious philosophy as well. It is then not surprising to say that a single infallible judge would quite significantly alter the way in which we reason about the world. It is perhaps for these reasons that we have never actually had any reports of the Krampus punishing a child. Instead, he is held at bay by the moral complexities of the world. But who knows? He may well be lurking in the shadows, silently watching us, and holding all in judgment, waiting for one so nasty as to summon him once more. Only time will tell.